And thank you so much for joining us today and for introducing yourself in the chat. We'd love for us to go ahead and do the same so you know who's on the other side of the camera. So hi everyone, if we have not met before, my name is Erin Cook. You can tweet with me at me at Erin K. Cook. My background is in upper elementary education, coaching, and special ed as well. My current role with RocketLit and with our sister site Inner Orbit is supporting educators with their science journeys. So we get to partner with lots of amazing educators across the country and just kind of talk about how best to use literacy in their science context. So that's part of what I do with RocketLit. And my favorite unit that I taught, I believe it was a 4th and 5th grade unit, was a unit called Blackout. And I was still in Florida at this time. And we talked about just flows of energy and generators and where all that can happen. But the driving phenomenon was, a town has a blackout and you need to figure out what happened. And it always resonated with us being in Florida. We always timed that unit somehow perfectly in the middle of hurricane season. So we always experienced usually a blackout at some point during that unit. So it was really applicable to our kiddos. So that was always super fun. And this is my colleague, Brenton.
Howdy, y'all. I feel like in California, it's like we would have like an earthquake unit. It's like, what do you do when the ground starts shaking and everything starts falling off? Which we had an earthquake, was it last week, just outside of LA. So that's where I live. So my name is Brendan Finch, Birdbrain Finch, if you want to tweet at me. I taught middle and high school science for 7 years in Los Angeles. I've written the majority of the content on RocketLit and then on our sort of sister site, Inner Orbit, where we have NGS assessments, and we'll talk about that a little bit later if you're interested and you're in a state that implements the NGSS and are looking for phenomena. My favorite unit when I was in the classroom was fast plants. It was so amazing to have my 6th or 7th graders watch these plants grow within a couple days, do some A/B testing. We had like a whole lighting rig and all of these little, sort of like egg carton trays, and kids would be able to A/B test and actually run an experiment and watch plants, grow and then pollinate the plants as well. It's just amazing. So hands-on and so relevant. Whereas the majority of the, the content that we cover in life science, or I feel like physical and earth science, it's really abstract at the middle school level, but that was a beautiful hands-on piece. And so we're really excited to be here to talk to you because we have a program for literacy called RocketLit. We write articles at 7 different reading levels. We have lots of content on there for typically grades 4 through 8, but we do have some high school and some lower elementary school teachers that use RocketLit as well. Every vocab word is explicitly defined, and we have lots of really juicy and interesting reports on the vocab words that students have covered, reading level growth, the number of words that were read. Relative to other, literacy platforms and differentiated platforms, RocketLit has adaptive reading, which means students go through and have a reading diagnostic when they first get started, and then we adjust their reading level as they go. So as students improve or as they struggle in articles, they'll move up and down reading levels. It's just kind of beautiful that as a teacher, you don't have to differentiate all that. And so we're really excited to talk to you about this. I'm going to kick it back to Erin to do our first activity.
We're going to go ahead and do a little bit of a group warm up today, just to get our minds kind of into this idea of literacy and science together. So we're going to be generating a collaborative word cloud together with Mentimeter. So the first thing I want you to do is think about this question you see on the screen. What 3 words or phrases come to mind when you think about literacy and science? Let's go ahead and see what some of our responses have been. So we'll kind of see, all of our word counts coming in. All right, look at this. All right, so how this word cloud goes is if there's been multiple responses of the same word, that word will appear larger. So you kind of pull some thematic elements out of it. So I see comprehension, challenging, jargon is really important too. When you think about literacy and science together, that specific vocabulary. I see graphs, potential, composing, numeracy, avoiding scams. I mean, seriously though, we're raising people who need to know these things so they can't avoid scams in the future. That's probably my favorite response of all of them. That's great. Lab write-up, data analysis, confusing, disjointed, awesome, fun, complicated, beautiful. Well, thank you guys so much for sharing these things. And I think this really just gets our minds into the role that literacy and science have together, which we're really going to unpack today through the 5E model, which we'll do in just a second. But keeping all of these things in mind that we can actually overcome some of these barriers or maybe think about jargon instead as a chance to introduce vocabulary, there'll be some really interesting moments to lean into today. So awesome. Well done for sharing all of that. You guys are awesome. We're going to go ahead and now talk about our objective of what we're going to be doing during our short time together. As by the end, we'll have explored the role of literacy through a science unit using this 5E framework with practical examples of actual strategies you can use. And we'll use RocketLit just because that's what we're most familiar with, but you can really use it with any other science text resource. So we're going to be using the 5E model just because it's a kind of a nice framework of a general flow of a beginning to the end of the unit. We know there's lots of different unit models out there, so feel free to make your own correspondence as you see fit. We're first going to briefly just dive a little bit deeper into the roles of science and literacy together because our modern school system has pulled them apart, but they actually are intricately linked together. So we're going to talk just a little more about that. And then the main part of our time today will be unpacking this 5E science model, talking about literacy at each of those E's and giving some really practical examples. And then we'll end our time together with an exit survey just to get some feedback from you all as well. Without further ado, I'm going to kick it to Brendan, who's going to kick us off a little bit more, diving into the ideas of literacy and science.
Woohoo! So when we think about literacy and science, I think the thing that everyone thinks about is reading. And though that is a foundational element of literacy, there's a lot more to it, especially in science. So we're looking at things like writing and making sure students are viewing. So in reading literacy can also involve graphs and data. There are a lot more that students need to do in a pictorial or graphical fashion in science and specifically that involves literacy. Super, super important. We also want students to be speaking and listening. So science that is done in a vacuum without communication is a difficult thing. Scientists should be doing research that's relevant to making progress and action oriented in the world. So we want our students to be developed as communicators as well. So all of that is sort of inside of the scientific understanding and scientific inquiry. So with the SCPs and the NGSS, we want students to be explicitly and progressively doing more and more and more as building skills and analyzing phenomena, looking at things they've never seen before, and engaging in inquiry. And all of that is the part of scientific literacy. So when we talk about literacy in science, we're not just talking about reading text once a week. We're talking about much, much more. And because we want this to be based on research, so we have an excerpt from an awesome research study here that kind of talks about the different areas of literacy and science and how all of those things interact. So first off, we want students to be able to construct understandings and then apply those big ideas to real problems. This is kind of the foundation of the NGSS. We want them to inform and persuade other people. So again, as I said earlier, science done in a vacuum is not helpful. We want science and we want scientists and we want our students to be able to persuade others, to be able to communicate effectively so that they can enact change and make the world a better place. So scientific literacy is really kind of the marriage of the nature of science, the scientific terms and concepts, so like core content ideas that we're going through, and then the interaction of science with society. So somebody said avoiding scams. I absolutely love that. That was one of the Mentimeter word cloud things because I think students need to be they need to be consumers of information and be very, very careful with how they're consuming information and how they're communicating information. So all super, super important stuff.
So now our minds are kind of centered in this idea of what science and literacy together are. Let's go ahead and dive into the main reason why we're here today is to walk through a 5E model and really talk about literacy at each of these roadmaps of this exact unit. So we could actually probably do an entire webinar on just one E. So this is going to be a general overview just to get your mind starting to think about how literacy can support your science goals throughout a unit. So in each E, I want you to consider the timing of these strategies and what purpose these strategies serve for that specific timing in your unit. So adding literacy in a specific and purposeful ways ignites the science, expectations or goals at the specific time of your unit, which is great. And we are going to talk about lots of strategies, so please don't feel overwhelmed. It's not about doing all of them, but picking and choosing strategies to gradually use over time. So at each E, we're going to deeply dive into 3 literacy strategies for that specific E, and then we're going to take one just a little bit deeper with a practical example, and we'll kind of model how you can use RocketLit or other text for that as well. So we're going to start at the beginning of your unit with the engage part of your 5E model. So in this E, students are engaged with a challenging situation. Prior knowledge is activated and questions are provoked. So how can you use literacy to increase that engagement in this part of your unit? So our first recommendation is to use literacy to build or activate schema, which is just another fancy word for background knowledge. So if you're with us in our last webinar, we really deeply dove into schema and how it's important to make sure the students are making the right connections to background knowledge and aren't creating misconceptions or like wrong connections to what they previously know. And it helps them also to see connecting multiple ideas together, not just learning, in silos. So you can use things like inventories or surveys or connections to a prior unit. All of those are great sources of literacy to kind of see where students are and what their background knowledge might be. A second way to use literacy is as a hook or to gain interest in a topic. So this is great, especially even for older learners who might be a little bit more resistant to dive into a new unit. So if you're using any type of media for current events, that's a great way to hook kids. So using a video or a podcast or article for students to connect what they're about to do to like the quote unquote real world and gain that important interest during this part of your unit. But the third strategy that we're going to really deeply dive into next as well is to use literacy to help develop wonderings. So you can use any of the media that I just mentioned, but what you're really doing to help students develop wonderings is you're positioning students to explicitly name what they wonder and then record it. And this idea of thinking and processing and also recording is absolutely a huge part of literacy in your writing, but you can also use it for your science purposes as well. So we're now going to hear from Brendan of how you can use a specific strategy to help develop wonderings.
So this is something I used to use at the beginning of many of the topics I'd cover in my own middle school classroom, and that's the KWL chart. So really, really simple. And these structures are just ideas that you can reuse in many, many different ways. Do not use all of these immediately, but you can use any of them. So KWL is super simple. Students write down what they already know about a topic after reviewing some basic material or you giving them, the basic gist of what we're covering. They write down what they wonder, so things they want to know, things they're interested in, ideally things that will be answered by engaging with the text or the media that they're looking through, and then learn. So things that students are learning as they go through or after they go through. This is where they synthesize and process and kind of think about or summarize what they read. So a good example of this is an article on how records work. So if we're going into analog and digital signals, if we're talking about waves, if we're talking about sound, then we can talk about records and look at how records work. And this article goes really, really specifically into details of waves and vibration, distortion, and analog. One of the NGSS standards is looking at the differences between analog and digital signals. So this is a very, very specific article that was written for that purpose. But what we want students to do is write down what they already know about, if they're super, super hipster kids, then maybe they already know about records. They've got like a big all record collection. And maybe they don't know anything about this. So they can write down what they're wondering and really, really fill that column. And then as they go through the rest of the article to make sure they write down what they learned, there's going to be explicit vocab words defined in all of our articles. So they should be writing those things down, or at least synthesizing them, analyzing them, summarizing them in some way.
All right. So once we are past the engage part of a unit, we're now moving into the next E, the second E, which is explore. So in this part of your unit, as you know, students are investigating the phenomenon. Prior knowledge is challenged, so good thing you activated it. And the prior E of engage, and ideas are being created. So let's talk about how can literacy really pack a punch in that part of your unit. So during your explore part of your science unit, you can use literacy to confront misconceptions. So what this really means is having some type of outside source that might not just be you as an educator, trying to explain, but some type of third, source of information that clearly identifies or explains or shows a concept for students to grapple with and maybe address some misconceptions. So a great example of this is maybe having a diagram with maybe, a little caption or something next to it, showing the flow of energy. So maybe, students might think that energy just magically appears when they turn on their light switch. It might just disappear, as soon as they turn off the light switch. So having some type of actual anchoring media for students to kind of go through might really help them address those misconceptions as well. A second way to use literacy in this part of your unit is to really explore, since that is this part of the unit, explore student-led interest in different resources that you provide. So using literacy resources for students to investigate and still of an introductory type of way, since this is the beginning of the unit, but for them to keep that, fire alive from the first E, but then also start to make connections and starting to explore this idea. So a great example might be if you have, an adaptations unit, maybe you're providing different resources on different types of animals that students might be interested in. They being able to draw comparisons between those different types of animals and the different resources they're exploring too, to see the different types of adaptations. Why would the polar bear have white fur when, the other animals have darker fur? So anyway, that might be a really good way to increase the exploration as part of your unit. But the third strategy, which we kind of actually jargon was one of our big words from our word cloud, which is really awesome, is to really be intentional about introducing specific tier 2 and tier 3 vocabulary words. So a tier 2 vocabulary word is academic language that maybe you don't use in your everyday speech or in writing, but it really helps convey a specific idea. So a good example might be transform. So you might use the word transform when talking about energy transformations, or how plants absorb certain nutrients and transform them into something else. So students might not know that word, especially if they may be a little bit younger learners as well. But then also introducing tier 3 vocabulary, which is incredibly domain specific, like photosynthesis. They're not going to really use that word outside of a specific science context. But being intentional with your introduction of which tier 2 vocabulary and which tier 3 vocabulary are we going to introduce, or how is a really important part of this part of your unit. So Brendan's now going to explain strategy for introducing that new vocabulary.
So Frayer models were one of my favorite things to use in my classroom, because it's something you can just have a bunch of printed out on half sheets and just be like, all right, we're doing Frayer models. That's what's happening right now. Frayer model is pretty simple. So it's just a vocabulary graphic organizer and helps students to sort of solidify and make concrete and draw connections between like the ideas that they're learning and other things they've learned before. So they define, usually you have the word that you're defining in the middle, a definition of their own words. So we want students to, ideally kind of summarize and put it in their own terms. Facts and characteristics. So characteristics is one of those things in science. That's a great tier 2 vocab word, where we're going to talk about the characteristics of living things, the characteristics of chemical substances. So having them list the characteristics about something that they're defining is awesome practice. Give examples. So some real concrete examples, real world examples, ideally, of things. And then non-examples is the last little chunk right there. So allowing students to, and there are lots of different versions of this. I used a couple different ones in my classroom, but non-examples are just, what this is not, so that students can we can make sure that any misunderstandings are made really clear. And as students start to, talk amongst themselves and look at their examples, if there's a think, pair, share, it's a great way to look at what something is and then what something is not. Cool. So in our curriculum, so we've got the space tug of war article, and we have the sun swinging around all these planets. Looks like the sun's having a lot more fun than everyone else. But the vocab term that students are reviewing in this is orbit. And so it's kind of an abstract term. It's definitely a tier 3 vocab word at the middle school level. And so we do want students to go through and to define the word orbit in their own words, to give some characteristics and facts about that, examples of what is orbiting and what is not. I think that the word spin or rotation and orbit are two things that get really tricky for kids, especially at the middle school level or upper elementary school levels. So giving non-examples would be, to have students maybe draw a picture or, do some kind of talk about spin or rotation. Those are non-examples of an orbit. And then, something like our little sun friend here and all of his planetary, I don't know if they're friends. It looks like a kind of, I don't know, tough relationship there. But yeah, so great way for you to use this as an introduction for new material, allowing students to review vocab words that they've already come in contact with, but you want to make more concrete and make sure that they're having practice exploring and getting that explicit vocab.
We're going to go ahead and just take a little bit of a pause just to kind of reflect. And then also we have so many different educators from different backgrounds and contexts, which is so important, to go ahead and pause and ask you all, because there's so many different strategies for this as well. Moving beyond these strategies, what other literacy strategies could you use during the engage and explore parts of a unit? So if you have any other strategies you'd love to share really intentionally about using during your first 2 E's of your unit, we'd love for you to put them in the chat so we can kind of steal each other's ideas. Educators are the best thieves, which is great. It's all for the kids. And I love that idea, Kevin, sharing their connections and their experiences, because As much as we try to really know our students, they might have an example that one of their peers super relates to. That maybe, we try to give all examples that we can, but a peer might just say, one analogy or one thing that they were thinking, and it might just really resonate with another student. So that's awesome. I love that.
I love that the notice wonder reminds me of was mentioned by two separate people immediately in that's awesome.
Great. Acting out words. I think, oh, you actually just said it there too with rotate and revolve. I was actually, someone had said that one earlier. And I think the physical action of that can really resonate and can those brains of what does it mean to rotate versus revolve. That's lovely. Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much. If you're still in the middle of sharing a strategy, please keep typing and putting that in. But to be good with our time, we're going to go ahead and finish up our 3E model here and talk about more strategies in other parts of your unit. But thank you so much for sharing that. You guys are awesome. So without further ado, let's go to explain, which is the third E of our 5E model. And in this part of your unit, students are explaining the phenomenon, new knowledge is gained and applied. So let's talk about literacy at this like almost midpoint of your unit. So the first thing I really want you to consider about literacy here is that if your goal is for students to increase their writing capabilities, scientific writing, definitely feel free to go for it. But this is still kind of a mushy place of a unit. So if you're finding that students are having a hard time explaining what they're trying to convey, especially with the phenomenon that you're using, I would encourage you to think about graphic representation or ways that students can verbally explain what they're trying to say. You might even, like some people have mentioned, have word walls or other things like that, that if they are struggling with that academic vocabulary, they can use those words to help, remind them to use that in their explanations. So that's one way you can think about literacy in this part of your unit. And the second one is to have access to those prior resources with them during an explanation moment to be able either to formally, cite those resources or to just even confirm. So an example is with that energy diagram that I mentioned before, that if students are trying to explain why there's a blackout in their town, they can actually use that diagram to either confirm, because they're now applying ideas to a new phenomenon, so they might be unsure, to confirm what they're thinking about the phenomenon or to specifically cite saying, as referenced in this specific resource, I'm going to use this to explain. So if you're intentional of using resources between these different E's, that kind of adds a lot of power to those resources as well, but students can constantly revisit them, which is really cool too. And then the third way that you can think about literacy in this part of your unit is providing targeted science understanding support. So since this is the midpoint of your unit, if students are still struggling with a specific science concept or specific learning goal, you can have literacy be the driver towards your support with those students in a small group setting. So what's really great about using literacy as a science support is that those resources can go with them. You as the educator cannot leave with them and go with them to remind them throughout the day. So if they have a resource that you've kind of unpacked together in a small group, they can reference that later, which is really important as well. So let's talk about this last specific strategy with how you can use science text to support students who might still have misconceptions of this part of your unit.
Awesome. So if you have taught in a classroom, you understand that group roles are the only things that is the only way that things are going to get done as students enter into a group. If you just cast a bunch of students into a collection and then say, go ahead and read this and do these things, it's probably not going to work out well, at least at the middle school level. That's just a recipe for bad news. So reciprocal teaching is one of the strategies that we recommend using with our articles, or frankly with any articles. So each student in the group has a different role. One student is predicting, they're making predictions, they're drawing inferences. It can be before, it can be during the reading. So they're just kind of looking at the text and looking at all of the different cues in the article and thinking about what they already know about this. Another student is going to be clarifying. So they may be rereading, they may be decoding, they may be looking up new words as they're going through the article. So this student's going to be really, really integral as the article is being read, and helping everyone else to understand and use context to understand. The questioning, so that's one other group role where students will pose questions, maybe quiz each other about what's going on there. They'll also answer questions if students do have questions. And it also promotes the interaction with peers. Again, that science without communication is not really helping. So we want students to be communicating constantly and working on their communication skills in groups, because that's a good way to get things done. And then also the final role will be for someone to to be summarizing. So you're now synthesizing, you're looking at big ideas, you're looking at important information and concepts, and also deciding if there's anything else that you need to know afterwards. And that summarizing, it's it's one of the common core skills. I think it's one of the best ways for students to synthesize everything that they've gone through, put terms and ideas in their own words, and sort of like make it much more concrete for them. For our article, A Competitive Nature, this is a great example of where you could use reciprocal teaching. So this article explicitly goes into, coexistent, advantages, environmental pressures, really, really specific tier 3 terms that are only used, well, at least environmental pressures are only used in science. So we want students, it's a pretty beefy and complex topic. So we want students to be going through and processing it with these really deliberate either roles or steps as they go through the article, so that we can make sure that not only are they reading the article, but they're interacting with it, interacting with each other, working on communication skills, and therefore building their understanding.
Moving into our 4th E, so leaving kind of the middle of the unit, heading towards the end here, is elaborate. So in this part of your science unit, students are applying their knowledge towards new situations, and knowledge is deepened and extended. So let's think about how literacy can continue those goals in this part of your unit. So the first thing we recommend of how you can use literacy is having students share and compare results and findings with peers. So depending on the activities or labs or simulations that you all are doing in class or virtually, consider how you can use literacy for students to compare those ideas. So it can just be more informal of verbal sharing. So say you did an activity, they did it with a partner, having those partnerships share with each other and considering why the results might be different or just encouraging a different perspective. All of that critical thinking and comparative analysis is science and literacy together. So those are lovely. It can also be more formal. So having students just to make a poster, and I mean, you could be as crazy with the poster as you want, or a little bit more informal of, hey, just put everything down in 5 minutes and then put those posters on the wall, and engaging in a gallery walk where students are looking at different thoughts or perspectives on your lab or activity. And even maybe everyone has 2 sticky notes and you have some sentence stems on the wall and everybody needs to leave 2 sticky notes on one of the posters. So they're not only reading, but also writing and considering and discussing, like so much literacy in that specific activity. So that's one way you can use literacy in this part of your unit. And a second way is to critique and revise models, explanations, or arguments, maybe from the beginning of the unit. So you can either, as a class, do it collaboratively. If you had a class model that you built together that now you need to revise after all this learning and skill development, you can do that together. Either actually writing, drawing a new model, or adding more details, or just writing a couple sentences about what they noticed or what they recommend being changed. Or even doing that individually. If they had their own model from the beginning of the unit, they can then revise it as well. So that's, one way of doing literacy in this part of your unit. And then the third is interest and free choice reading, which we did mention in a prior E, if you kind of remember as well with the explore part. But this part of your unit, the resources that you give might be a little bit more advanced. If you can consider the free choice reading in the explore section, students are just starting to get into the ideas of the unit. And those articles and free choice resources might be a little bit more introductory, but this is where students can really kind of make larger connections to maybe more advanced ideas. So let's talk about a structure of how you can support interest in free choice reading and the elaborate part of your unit.
Cool. So let's get all Google on this with Genius Hour. So one of the structures that Google and I think other technology companies have in place is they allow their employees a certain percentage of time where they can actually work on their own projects and follow passion projects, not related to their job function, maybe not even related to their role or the project they work on, just to kind of build and play and learn. So what we want students to do as they go through this, and a structure that we have on RocketLit, is to think about a specific topic, for them to think about why they chose that topic or that article, what resources they need, and they went through, and what else they need later on, and that comes later in this too. What they learned as they went through that topic, and what are the next steps for them. So what else do I need to clarify? What else am I curious about? And where do I go from here? So on RocketLit, we have a couple different ways you can assign articles. So you can assign them as curriculum articles where you're going to read this article right now for direct instruction. Like we're going to learn about, environmental pressures. Interest articles are intended so you can go through a unit and let's say we talked about, environmental pressures and adaptation and, niches that different organisms have. So there's different kinds of plants, which talks about autotrophs, moss, algae, ferns, which aren't really topics that we cover in, like photosynthesis unit because they're kind of, like external interesting, diversions from that. A little bit of a, like sink your teeth into something once you understand the basic concepts. So all of these articles are things you can go into RocketLit or, anywhere, find articles that are related to the topic, extend it a little bit, elaborate on whatever it is that you're learning about so that students can apply what they've learned, sort of in the spirit of the NGSS as well, apply what they've learned to something novel that they haven't seen before and see a really specific instance of these more general and abstract concepts.
Let's round the corner and complete our 5E model here and discuss the last E, which is evaluate. So at this part of your unit, students are reflecting on their knowledge and learning process, and a summative assessment might occur. We know we're assessing throughout all the time anyway, but this is kind of the bow on the unit assessment piece. So for literacy in this evaluate part of your unit, we have a sister site named InterOrbit, which actually does all of this from beginning of the unit to the end. So we have hundreds of phenomena with assessment questions ranging from prior knowledge questions to summative questions. We're so intentional to include GIFs to highlight just beautiful science, but also kind of pull apart more abstract phenomena, diagrams, charts, actual didactic text as well for students to make sense of new situations. So feel free to check us out if you haven't already, but InterOrbit might be a great way to use literacy in this part of your unit. But otherwise, another thing you could do is to revisit those KWL charts from the beginning of the unit. So what's so powerful about this is they can edit that K column, which is no. They might have some actual misconceptions that they thought they knew, but now they've gone through the unit and they can actually change that out as well. They can also, in the W column with the wonderings, they might be able to answer some of the wonderings they had from the beginning of the unit and probably add more too, because science is never finished. And then with the L column, they can definitely add things that they've learned as well. So it's kind of a nice way to see their revision of their thinking, but then also be able to celebrate the things they have learned. And lastly, for literacy in the value part of your unit, you can use framing reflection questions for students to intentionally look back at specific resources or moments in a unit and reflect on the decisions they made as a learner and how they went through those. So verbalizing and then recording those ideas, either verbally or written, is such a great strategy for reflection for literacy, but also for science learning as well. So Brendan's going to show us about specific ways that you can frame those reflection questions here at the end of your unit.
Cool. So this metacognition is really, really important. We want students to reflect. And I had on the back of every exit slip, a self-reflection where students would write down, this is what I understood. This is what I didn't understand. These are further questions that I have. So as I would review their work for the day and whether we met our objective or not, I would also see, okay, these are things that I need to cover or clarify later, or you thought you got it, but you didn't get it. And students sort of like thinking about how they think is really, really important. So, in the PBL context, there's this beautiful reflection questions as you go through a project and you think about the project at the end of the project, sort of retrospectively, do some metacognition. On RocketLit, though, we also have a whole bunch of strategies or tools for this. So we do include all the vocab words that have been covered by students and in their accounts, so they can monitor their progress and they can reflect on what they got or didn't get as they go through articles. So things like Archimedes' principle or environmental pressures or even niche are very, very specific terms. And we want students to think about, what did I understand or what did I not understand about this? What do I still need to do in the future? And have them reflect on that. So as they go through, they can sort of figure out, thinking about their thinking, which is an advanced reader strategy and skill. Many of y'all are probably doing this right now. You're thinking about how you're, processing the information that we're even giving in this presentation as teachers and educators. And so we want students to sort of build that and explicitly give structures for them to think about their thinking and for metacognition so that they can start to do it on their own later on.
We're going to pause one last time to ask the similar question, but now thinking about, kind of the last 3/5 of a unit. And we'd love to hear from you in the Zoom chat if there are any other strategies that you might have. So moving beyond the strategies we just mentioned here, what other literacy strategies could you use during the explain, elaborate, and evaluate parts of a unit? Oh, beautiful peer feedback, CER statements to explain the unit phenomena. Great summary tables from ambitious science teaching. Different modalities to explain ideas. Love that. I used Flipgrid for a little bit too, and you can decide how long you want students to record something. So if you don't want to listen to 2-minute videos, you can have them try to just record something in 20 seconds. That's helpful as well. Fishbowl or Socratic seminar. Beautiful team video projects. I appreciate these alternate types of literacy as well, thinking about how visual or graphic or auditory can also be used in this. This is great. But what we've done is we've walked through a unit, which does cycle, and it's probably not as clean as these one arrows to the next, of course. But we thought we could really consider how literacy might engage students, help them explore, explain, elaborate, and evaluate, and how you can be intentional using literacy at each of these moments of your science unit to further accomplish your science teacher goals of what you're trying to do with that specific timing of your unit. So we've done so much in our time together today. We've explored the role of literacy through all of the 5E parts of a framework, science unit model. We've really thought about timing and purpose for these activities. And what's really interesting too is one activity might actually be used in different parts of a unit, and you can kind of tweak it to have different purposes. So for example, a gallery walk might be a great way to do a hook, but it can also be a great way to do elaborate. So if you're really intentional about the timing and the purpose of these different activities, one might actually be flexible for more than one part of your unit, which is exciting. But we talked about using a KWL chart for engage, the Freyer model for vocabulary and explore, reciprocal teaching, small group structure for explain, Genius Hour for elaborate, and then finally project-based learning reflection questions for your evaluate part of your unit. So we talked about so many strategies today. Of course, choose the ones that resonate the most with you and your students, and do not feel like you need to do all of them, of course, as well.
So we would love to help you with this work. This is what we do. So RocketLit is our adaptive and differentiated reading website. We have hundreds of articles for both science and social studies. Our goal really is that you as a teacher do not have to differentiate content, because that is nonsense and it takes a long time. So all of our articles are written at 7 reading levels. Students take a quick little reading diagnostic, and then we serve them content at their independent reading level. The goal is just clear and helpful data focused around student understanding of vocab words, really content driven. We want students to have access to independent reading and also understand core concepts and ideas that they need to understand for science and social studies. We would love to have you. So we're offering free pilots for teams of teachers. So if you haven't tried RocketLit before, or if you're interested in getting started, you can use that calendar link that I dropped in the chat and make a meeting with us. And we'd love to chat with you. We can show you around, answer questions, give you and or the teachers you work with a quick PD for getting started. And we'd love to support you.